Well, today we're back to Genesis and back to the life of Joseph. And you know what? Today I'm going to put a lot on you for interpretation. Oh, no, you mean you have to listen? Yes, you have to listen. And we're going to do some application at the end. Because again, I think one of the skills when you're reading the Bible, especially narratives, a narrative is where it tells a story, is to tell the story and to read it. And at the end of the story, if you do a big so what, then you've missed the great opportunity. So we're going to do a so what at the end. I have a whole bunch of so what's in my pocket. Not really, so what? Yeah, who cares? Wise guys in the audience. So I'm going to put the onus on you to see if you can observe some so what. So as we go through the story, we're going to go through the story relatively quickly. It's very simple. And then we're going to sit back and spend a little more time than normal just trying to say, so what? So what's the big deal? So what do we understand? And I'll lead us a little bit on that and see where we get to. So we're in the life of Joseph, as you recall. And Joseph is on his way to becoming quite a big dude in Egypt, and that's by God's design, not to inflate Joseph, but to actually use him to help save the nation of Israel and Egypt. So that's the providential direction that God is taking Joseph right now. And just to recap right here we are floating over Egypt, looking toward the northeast, and here's present-day Israel. It's in these yellow boundaries right here. And what happened was that Joseph and his brothers and his family all lived in the middle of Canaan right here. Some Midianite traders came from the other side of the Red Sea, and they passed through Israel, and on their way through that, Joseph's angry brothers, who hated him so much they wanted to kill him, but decided the better thing to do was just to sell him into slavery for the rest of his life, which I don't think that's a better option. But anyway, they sell him into slavery, and the Midianite traders take him as something to trade. They make it into Egypt, along with their spices they're going to trade and all that kind of stuff. And they sell Joseph into captivity, into a relatively highly placed authority person in Pharaoh's court. And that's where he is now as a house slave. And then eventually, because of bad events in his life, not because he did anything wrong, he's placed in jail. And today, we come to 13 years after he left Israel. 13 years. 13 years he has either been a house slave for Potiphar, or he's been in jail because Potiphar's wife lied about him and put him in jail. 13 years. He left when he was 17. So imagine yourself being kidnapped at the age of 17, being taken from your family, being taken from everything that's familiar, taken off into nowhere land, into captivity, doing everything right and still being paid back by being put in jail. Now, would you be a whiner at this point? Or... Oh, we don't have to finish that, do we? All the whiners are here today. Yeah, we'd be whining because we'd say this is not fair. And it wasn't fair. It was not fair at all. If you want justice, there has been no justice in this story so far. And yet, it's all been by God's design and by God's providence. So the next time you go through something which is highly unfair, you can go back to Joseph and say, yeah, but I remember the story of Joseph, and he went through cascading serial events of unfairness by God's design to do something far beyond what he could ever foresee. And that's what we're in the course of looking at right now. That's what makes the story so exciting. So he's in jail. It's been 13 years. And we pick up the story today in chapter 41. So here we are, chapter 41. And this starts today with what I call the royal dreams. That's an actual photograph of the Pharaoh for today. Not really. Okay, so verse 1 of chapter 41. After 2 whole years... 2 whole years after Joseph had talked about the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. Remember that previously? So 2 whole years passed. He's still in jail. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive. I don't know what an attractive cow looks like. Plump. There we go. Okay. Plump, and they fed in the reed grass. So evidently, I looked this up. This is pretty common practice. The best stuff to eat in Egypt is actually right on the banks of the Nile because these reeds and stuff grow very, very green. And so the cattle would actually wander, about chest deep into the water and eat. It looked like some kind of gigantic manatee out there that was eating reeds, And so they would be chest deep. The cows would be chest deep, just eating the reeds out there, and it'd be nice and cool, and everything they can eat. It's like a cow paradise. So this is what Pharaoh sees. There's 7 of them. They're standing out there and they're just eating to their heart's delight, feeding on the reed grass. Verse 3, and behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin. So we know what that means. They came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. So now you have 7 cows and 7 cows standing up out of the water, fat, plump, lovely ones, and then skinny, ugly ones. Okay? So they're side by side, 7 and 7. You're looking at them and you're thinking, wow, what is going on? He's having this dream, and what comes next astonishes him. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh woke. Ah, what's that all about? So, you get the picture? So the ugly, thin, skinny cows suddenly become meat eaters, and they eat the 7 plump cows that are beautiful. Okay, so that's what happened. So, if you're in an agrarian culture, this is like one of the worst nightmares you've ever seen in your entire life. The best cows in the world get eaten up by these skinny, ugly cows. Ah! Now, he's going to tell us a little bit more about this story in a second, but let's just leave it right there. He awakes because it's such a nightmare, and then he falls asleep again, verse 5, and he dreams a second time. And behold, 7 plump ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And, we commonly think of this as being corn, but they didn't have corn there. So you're going to have to imagine something else. Something like they had a lot of barley and a lot of wheat, more barley than they had wheat. So think about looking at a single stalk of barley that usually has maybe 1 or 2 heads on it. But now these are mutants, and it's got like 7 heads on it. So this is really quite an astonishing head of barley, for instance. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk, verse 6, and behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. Yeah. You seen a parallel going on here? Thin and blighted by the east wind. By the way, in Egypt, all the bad, nasty, drying weather comes from the east. That also happens in Israel as well. If you read through the Old Testament, they talk about an east wind. That's the bad wind. The good winds come from the Mediterranean from the west. The bad, drying winds come from the east. So that's what happens. So they're all dried out, hardly even suitable for eating at all. And then it goes on, says verse 7, the thin ears, they swallowed up the 7 plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So I kind of like that. Because he wakes up and goes, oh, I've been dreaming. Actually, it's more forceful than that. It's like been having a nightmare. I've been having nightmares. These are all nightmarish things. So again, the bad-looking grain turns around and eats the plump grain. What? So Pharaoh is a little bit kind of freaked out by this, so he looks for an interpretation. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men, the guys who have crystal balls and all that kind of stuff. And he calls them in, he assembles them in his court, and he tells them. He told them the dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So he tells these great dreams about the lovely cows and the ugly cows and the lovely grain and the ugly grain. And they say, beats us. We don't know what it means. Just don't know what it means. Now, he's deeply disturbed by this, and he's trying to satisfy his deep disturbance by having his guys tell them what this is all about. In fact, he's hoping they tell him something that'll soothe him, that'll cause him to say, that was just the freakiest thing I've ever been through. And they'll say, yeah, but that's okay. It just means that, you're going to have pizza next Friday or something like that. So he's hoping for something favorable. But there's nothing. They say nothing at all, which leaves Pharaoh still deeply disturbed about these scenes. And then we move on to chapter 2 of this, Act 2, and we have a royal resource. So while he's in the middle of this despair, something happens. Verse 9, the chief cupbearer, remember we had him in the previous chapter, the chief cupbearer, who, by the way, comes to Pharaoh at least 2 and sometimes 3 and 4 times a day, giving him his cup of wine that's been tested by yours truly to make sure it's not poisoned. He sees Pharaoh all the time, and he sees Pharaoh dejected. He knows Pharaoh's condition, and bing! A light goes off in his head. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and read chapter 40. But he'll tell us what happened right here. The chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. And Pharaoh's kind of saying, okay, so, well, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, who is Joseph. Now, by the way, you notice he doesn't say a fellow prisoner. Actually, Joseph at the time was a prisoner, but he had nice responsibilities there. But in order to kind of make it not sound like there was this, there's scraggly, bearded, burlap-wearing guy that looked like John the Baptist, he says there was this servant of the captain of the guard. So it sounds reputable. And something happened. Well, when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream, and as he interpreted to us, so it came about. Dun, dun, dun. Read the previous chapter. This is exactly what happens. And he goes on, I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Yeah. So now he remembers him. Remember last time we saw this, Joseph says to the cupbearer, hey, when you make it to Pharaoh, tell him all about me and about the injustice, and I was thrown here unjustly. It's just not right that I should be here. And when you're talking to him, say, hey, Joseph told me this, so please get me out of jail. Yeah, it was his attempt to try and sort of manipulate God's agenda for himself, because he lapsed into thinking it was all about him. What he doesn't realize, we saw last time, was that if God had sprung him out of jail right then, the nation of Egypt and Israel would have perished. So it was a purely selfish thing. So he says, listen, he told me that I would live and the baker would die, and boom, that's exactly what happened. This Hebrew guy, who's the servant of the captain of the guard. So Pharaoh perks up and goes, huh, and we get to Act 3, that I call a royal summons, because of course the first thing you're going to do as Pharaoh is bring him before me. Okay, so that's exactly what happens. Verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. By the way, many times the pit was a nice kind of byword for a prison, because it's a pit. You can't get out of it. So they wake him up, they bring him out, and when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. So again, he really does look like a prisoner. He looks really bad. And you can't bring someone looking like that in the presence of Pharaoh. And actually, Pharaoh would be probably a little bit incensed by the fact that now he's going to consult with a guy that looks like a dirtbag. Pharaoh doesn't do that. So they said, listen, Joseph, you got to clean up. He shaves, he puts on clean clothes, he looks presentable. He looks like a guy that can be trusted in that sense. He covers up the fact that he's a prisoner. He's still a prisoner. Covers up the fact that he's a prisoner. And they bring him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said that you, said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, nope, it's not in me. What? It's not in me. What? But and then he finishes his thought, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Now remember, he said this to the other guys in prison too. God's the one who's coming up with this. It's not me. So when Pharaoh comes to him and wrongly presumes that there's something supernatural about Joseph, Joseph says, no, it's not in me. It's not me. It's God who does these things. Now, it's an interesting thing to stop right here, because this will help you in the later kind of thinking phase, the interpretation phase. It's interesting that right here, Joseph could have said, yeah, I'm the dream guy. In fact, that animated movie I talked about a couple weeks ago was called Joseph, King of Dreams. That's badly titled. God's the King of Dreams. He's the one who interprets these things. Joseph just had this relationship with God. So very clearly right here, instead of taking credit for anything that's ever happened up to this point and taking credit for what's going to happen next, he very clearly and rightly says, God does this. It's not me. In the interpretive part of this later on, you can ask yourself as we get there, how often do you do that with people who don't know God? So just think about that. Okay, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So now Pharaoh's intrigued. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, okay, behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile, 7 cows, plump and way attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass, and then 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly, and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. Yeah, these poor ugly cows. Again, we looked at the beginning as we hovered over Egypt. That Nile delta that spreads out is a gorgeous place. I mean, it's just very rich and very fertile. Every year, or every couple of years at least, the Nile overflows with water. It collects all the water from Africa, and it comes there, and it comes down with such a whoosh that it overflows the banks. And they realize that it's better for us not to build dams to keep the Nile in. It's better to actually let the Nile overflow, because it brings dirt with it, and that dirt comes out and makes a new level of topsoil for all of our crops. And this is the greatest thing on earth. And it was. It's a great place to grow things. So Pharaoh is not used to seeing ugly cows, because they've always been standing chest deep. Do cows have chests? flank deep. I don't know what I like. Anyway, this deep. And eating. And so he was just unfamiliar with cows that looked that bad. So that's part of why he was so disturbed. Like I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. And then the thin, ugly cows ate up the first 7 plump cows. And when they'd eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as at the beginning. See, we didn't get that before. So they eat the plump cows, but they themselves don't look well fed anymore. I mean, you think they would. You think that the skinny cows would eat the plump cows and go, oh, yeah, bloop, lovely cows. But he says, no, they ate these cows, and they still looked really ugly and malnourished. And so I woke up after that. Well, because it was a nightmare. And I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good, 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprouted up after them, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to all my magicians, crystal balls and all. Well, there was none who could explain it to me. So he tells the entire story to Joseph, and he tells him also that none of my magicians, none of my wise guys could come up with any idea of what's going on. So I'm still deeply disturbed by this. So Mr. Hebrew tells the future for the cupbearer and the baker. What do you think? And that's when we get to Act 4. A royal response. So he gives him a response. So Joseph says to Pharaoh, verse 25, now the dreams of Pharaoh, they're actually one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. So the dream about the cows and the dream about the grain is actually sort of the same dream, which we were picking up anyway because there was a theme. You know, you got the fat lovely and the skinny uglies. And yeah, so we got that. This is one dream about what God's about to do. The question in my mind and Pharaoh's mind probably right here is, why would God give me 2 dreams that say the same thing? So the 7 good cows, Joseph says, are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. So the good cows and the good ears are 7 and 7. There's 7 good years, because when you have 7 good years in a grain culture, your cattle are lovely and fat, and your grain has 7 instead of 1 kernel on the top. Well, that's a pretty cool deal. So it's a wonderful time. It's a very clear picture of a lovely, luscious, lots of food. It's a nice, nice time, but it's only 7 years of it. Well, that sounds pretty good. But the 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them, they're 7 years. And the 7 empty years blighted by the east wind, they're 7 years of famine. 7 years of great living, 7 years of famine. So, it's as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he's about to do. That's it. Now, I'm going to stop you right here because I want you to think about this before we get to the end too. So God is going to do this to Egypt and the world. 7 years of good, 7 years of famine. And now God is speaking through Joseph about this, that it's going to happen for the purposes of saving Egypt and Israel. So why would God, who's going to cause this to happen, also somehow bring remediation by telling Joseph? That is to say, why doesn't he just not do it? Think about that. Okay. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land. By reason of the famine that will follow, it'll be very severe. So it's always, I mean, it's like us too. When you're in very good years, it's good, and you think this is going to go on forever. But then the 7 good years stop, and the bad years start, and you don't have to get very far into the bad years, and you can't even remember when it was nice. I mean, that's how bad it is. And as well, he says that the bad years, in a real sense, are going to consume the good years. It'll be as though nothing good ever preceded them. It's just bad. So that's what's going to happen. It will be very severe. Now, Pharaoh is thinking right here, well, let me ask you. Pharaoh gets this news. What's the first thing he's thinking with Joseph standing in front of him, this Hebrew foreigner? What can I do? What can I do? How do we prepare? That's a good thought. Actually, if I was Pharaoh, I'd say, what's that? Do I believe him? Yeah. It seems though he does, because he just accepts this. Now, see, if I was Pharaoh, since I knew that Joseph had a special connection to God, I'd say, Joseph, maybe your God can stop this. What do you say? What do I have to do, Joseph, to make it so that you'll appeal to your God? Because after all, in the pagan culture of Egypt with all their many gods, what you did to make a god do something for you, you gave him something. You sacrificed something to him, right? I mean, that's a natural thing to do. So now Joseph has told you the truth about what's going to happen in the future. This God who's going to bring it about has told it through Joseph. So maybe this God of Joseph's wants me to give him something to stop this thing from happening. That would be a very natural thought process for Pharaoh to do. So now that he's got someone who's connected to this God, I would make him an offer. Say, well, Joseph, tell you what. If we do, if we make a sphinx with the face of your God on it and worship him, can we get out of this famine thing? Or something stupid like that. I mean, he's going to try and make some kind of deal. I would ask Joseph right here, what is it your God wants and will do it if he'll relent from this 7-year famine? That's what I do. You got the guy who's got a connection with God. That's exactly what I do. That's the thinking. Well, Joseph says, and the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Which is by way of saying, if you were thinking that was something you could do to kind of avert this through me, not going to happen. And why? That's why you got 2 dreams that said the same thing. In dream interpretation, evidently, I have never taken this course, but in dream interpretation, when you have one dream and then a second dream that's different but the same, that means it's done. It's not going to be changed. It's done. It's done. And that's what he says to Pharaoh. So in a way, if Pharaoh is thinking, what do I have to do to appease to your God? Joseph says, oh, that's too late. You had 2 dreams. Now, if you had 1 dream, we could probably talk about it. But you had 2 dreams. That means it's fixed. It's going to happen. Well, there you go. There you go. Oh, well. And at this point, depending on the heart of Joseph, you might be standing there saying, too bad for you, Mr. Pharaoh. I mean, after all, I'm in jail unjustly by one of your servants. Should never have happened. Too bad you're going to have 7 years of famine. Too bad for you. Glad I'm not you. And you could wish, yeah. But being in prison, being away from home for these 13 years, I would be bitter enough to say, well, serves you right, dude. I mean, I've had nothing but injustice since I've been in Egypt. So 7 years of famine, you're probably all going to die. It's not my problem. The heart makes a big difference when you're dealing at this level. because he could dig his heels in and gloat in the judgment of God right here, because he knows God's bringing this about. And so he could gloat. Where would that serve God's purpose? That's exactly right. If Joseph was really intent on himself, this would be the end of the story. He'd say, too bad for you. I'm glad I'm not in your shoes. Hope it works out in the end. Now get me out of jail. Right? I would walk away from it. But now remember, that would be the end of the story if Joseph was terminally self-centered. Really. He would probably work this situation to get himself out of jail and go home. And that would be the end of the story. And there would be 7 years of good and 7 years of bad that would demolish Egypt and Israel. If Joseph was set on himself. Does God gamble our futures on our selfishness or not selfishness at any point in time? That's a huge gamble, I would think. But now we've been talking about the providence of God. The providence of God goes far beyond just the circumstances in this world. The providence of God goes into the very core of the nature of your heart. And that's a thought that we could spend hours just kind of working through what that means. But God knew that we would get to this point, and Joseph would not blow the plan by becoming, terminally selfish about all this stuff and blowing his opportunity to do something with Pharaoh. Okay? So it's not the end of the story, thankfully. Joseph, not being asked, offers this. Which, by the way, when you're in the presence of a mighty king, you never speak until spoken to. You respond to questions, and now he's offering a freebie, which could technically get him killed. Technically. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint more guys, overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and then let them gather all the food in these good years that are coming in, store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. That is, Pharaoh has taken this grain and make it for food for the cities, and let them keep it like in big grain silos like this, and put a sign that says Pharaoh's grain. I just added that part, by the way. So he says, I got a plan for you. Do this. Do this. This will work. Okay? Take 1/5. For 7 years, you'll have lots of grain, and that'll get you through the bad years. Just thinking, Pharaoh. Just thinking. You know, this is what I'm... Well, you know, it's interesting because Pharaoh can say, you little twerp. I'm in charge of Egypt, the most mighty nation in the entire earth, and you're some Hebrew guy who's probably was a slave in the jail, and you're giving me advice? Who do you think you are? Well, he didn't ask for the advice. He just asked for the interpretation of the dream. This is a freebie. This is a freebie. This is impertinent in many ways in royal structures. You don't do this. But Joseph is thinking about the well-being of Egypt. I don't know why, except for the fact that God's with him. Something has changed in the heart of Joseph. When we roll back and see his life in Canaan with his brothers, he really is terminally bent in on himself, selfish-wise. Here, he's thinking about the well-being of a nation which will become the worst enemy of Israel to come up, and has been the worst enemy of people around the world. But he's saying, this is what I'm offering for your good. Now, why would Pharaoh ever give any weight to this suggestion from this little twerp from a foreign area? Why would he ever give any weight to this? Well, because he got the interpretation of the dreams right. He got the interpretation of the dreams right with the baker and also with the cupbearer. And Pharaoh is predisposed to think that he's got the right answer to his dreams as well. Maybe, just maybe, this kid has some connection with some God we don't know anything about, who will be the one who brings the famine. Maybe, if he was right with the dream interpretation, maybe he's right with the recommendation. Because maybe the recommendation isn't coming from the twerp kid. It's coming from God. Maybe. Now, if you want to do a little homework assignment before next time, Pharaoh decides to take him up on his offer to find somebody. I want you to look in the next chapter, well, that's not the next chapter, it's the second half of this chapter in 41, and go and find out what Pharaoh's job requirement is for this man who's going to take over and do this stuff. So that's just a little freebie. Go find out what, because Pharaoh says what it's going to be, his job requirement. It's a description. Okay, there's 36. This way, food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Well, you know, it sort of it sounds good. Sounds good. And now we're into the interpretation. We're done for today with the passage, and we'll pick up the part B of the passage next week. So what? What do you glean from all that? Let me just start the discussion with something like this, too. From Pharaoh's perspective, this is Pharaoh's first impact with the God of Israel. Okay? So what is it he's learning about Yahweh, which is the name of God, and Joseph and Pharaoh himself? What is he learning about this God of Israel that is so unusual? He can't be bought. Yeah, probably. He didn't try and offer even, but he can't be bought. He controls the weather. Now remember the Egyptian gods? There's lots of gods for the different parts of everything. There was a sun god too, right? So God of the Nile. There's many gods. How many gods were there? You just did this recently. There were at least 10 because the 10 plagues were aimed at the... So anyway, yeah. So this is a very different God. This is a God who seems to be in control of so much that he can control whether we have plenty or little. But remember, he doesn't try and bribe this God. He doesn't try and pay him off to try and get him to do something for him. But what does this God do instead? What does this God do instead? He agreed? What does this God do instead? You don't have to bribe him. See, I told you this is the hard part. The amazing thing about this God of Israel is that this God of Israel has come to solve the problem before it starts. This God of Israel has taken the initiative to come and to be the one who solves the problem before Pharaoh even knows the problem exists. This is very different from the gods of Egypt. The gods of Egypt were always presumed to be gods who kind of stood on the sidelines, and until you said the right words and used the right bribes, they would do nothing. They were unconcerned about mankind. They didn't care what mankind did until mankind groveled far enough to make the gods feel important. They paid them enough, and then they would do something. But this God of Israel seems to be interested before we even know we have a problem. That's very odd. And this God is the same God that we have, who before we even knew we had a problem, solved it in the blood of Christ. Ooh, very interesting. This God of Israel is the same God of us who says, whether you know it or not, while you were yet sinning, Christ died for you. Before you even knew you had a problem, before, even when you were living in your 7 years of what seemed like good, God says, but you don't understand. You have a terminal problem with sin, and I'm going to fix that problem before you're even aware of it. And I will take the initiative not only to get you the message about my solution to that problem, but I will take the initiative to solve it even beforehand. Now that's unlike any of the gods of Egypt. That's unlike any of the gods that the world has ever created out of man's image. These unrelated gods, these gods who are far away, these gods who have to be tempted into working on our behalf by the payment of a bribe. This God seems to know what's going to happen. And not only is he going to fix it, he is actually going to bring me a guy here, Joseph, who is going to tell me all about what's happening, what's going to happen, and how God's going to fix it. Someone who's like a messenger for God himself. Someone through whom salvation will be brought to my people. He's not the Savior necessarily, but he brings the message of the Savior. And the Savior himself is God. He's the one that does this. Other so whats. Do you have any other so whats about us? So whats. So what? So for Pharaoh, at least in this particular case, Pharaoh is somewhat confused at this point, and I'm speculating about this, but I think he is, because this is unlike anything he's ever experienced before, not only in his theology of the gods, but about this little Hebrew twerp who seems to be connected with this God. And as the events go on, by the way, these events will be confirmed, and his understanding about who this God is will grow because it's going to happen just like he says. You going to say?
7 years of drought. It's not just Egypt that's in drought.
Exactly.
It's the lands around it.
It's not just Egypt that's going to go through this. All the lands around.
Including Israel.
Right. Exactly. So, and that brings a second interpretation. I'll just restate this. The benefit that's going to happen from this is not only going to be on the nation of Israel, but it's going to be on Egypt as well. What does that tell you about God's love for people? It's the whole world. It's not just his promised people. He does have a plan going with his promised people, but that doesn't set them higher or lower or apart in any particular way, but they were the vehicle through which, the nation vehicle through which he was going to make himself known. And guess what? Right now, in this very second, standing in front of Pharaoh, Joseph is making known who God is, and God's doing it through his people, Joseph. But God's love for mankind is not exclusively set on Israel. God's love is for all mankind. Yeah. And now this is very unusual in pagan theologies. The gods are only interested in the people who own their gods, right? People who are foreigners or aren't part of our system, it's not that they just don't believe in our gods, it's that they're actually outside the benefit of our gods. They don't qualify. They're not pure Greeks, and so the Greek gods aren't going to work for them. They're not pure Romans, so the Roman gods aren't going to work for them. Doesn't matter if you believe in them or not. But this God is bringing good to people that don't even recognize who he is. That's the idea of common grace. There is unique grace that's brought to us through Jesus and the blood on our behalf. But there is, in a sense, in a larger context in this creation, a common grace where God gives to all mankind good that they never deserved. And the offer of salvation is offered to all mankind, not just his people. And so that's what Pharaoh's starting to understand right here. In a very simple transaction right here, suddenly his entire mind is being blown up about this God of the Hebrews, who is the God of these Hebrews. And maybe the God of this Hebrews, maybe he's not real. Maybe all this isn't going to happen. But after all, I do have this sharp kid in front of me. He seems to have interpreted the dream. What do I have to lose? I'll go find some guy who will run my kingdom for me under the presumption things will go bad. And if they don't, that's okay. I'll just kill Joseph. No, right? So Pharaoh's got nothing to lose. At this point, he may not fully understand the God of Israel, nor is he necessarily fully trusting him, But there's something in his mind going, there's something about this kid's God. Something about this kid's God. I'm going to give him a little bit of string here and see where this goes. And so next week we'll see where it goes after this. And find out Pharaoh's job requirements for the person who's going to run the country. Because it happens in the next couple verses. The job requirements of the person who runs the country. So here we start to unfold in this incredible story the providence of God. God is in control, always has been in control, always is in control. He's even in more control than he is of your tendency to be selfishly oriented and sinful. He's even more in control than Joseph's own varied sinfulnesses and selfishness about himself. God is having what he wants to have happen in his providence, and he's bringing it about so that there'll be salvation not only for Egypt but for Israel. And there's nothing in chance oriented in any of this. The providence of God. And in the process, God will make known to a foreign nation who he really is. So that 400 years later, after the slavery of Israel, they'll have no excuse. They can never say, I don't know what your God's like. Because in a moment, they're going to know. They're going to know. God is serving notice to the nation of Egypt about his kindness and his goodness and the initiative of his love on the behalf of those who don't even know him. 400 years later, they won't have an excuse. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for this amazing story. Continue to open our hearts and our minds through your Spirit to understand more than just what the story says, to understand who you are and the God of Israel that's becoming unveiled to the heart and mind of Pharaoh himself and to those who don't know you. And God, I pray that as we walk the streets and the places that we go, that just like Joseph, that we would attribute to you what is of your hand publicly, to tell people, this is what God has done for me. This is who he is. He's a reality in my life. It's not in me, it's him. It's God himself who loves you as much as he loves me. So, Lord, I pray that you would give us courage and boldness in these decreasingly godly times, that you might be glorified and made manifest, and the light of who you are would shine through us as we give glory and credit to you. It's not in me, Joseph said. It's my God who does this. So thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.